Kent, England, winter, 1815. The storm arrived without mercy, tearing through the village of Willowmere with winds that screamed like wounded creatures and rain that fell in sheets thick enough to drown the world. Flora Sutton stood at her cottage window, watching the ancient oak in her garden bend and twist under nature's assault, its branches clawing at the darkness like desperate fingers reaching for salvation that would not come. At 28 years old, Flora had learned that life rarely offered warnings before it shifted its course. The tempest that had taken her husband 10 years earlier at Trafalgar had been far more devastating than any winter gale. Yet something about this particular night made her uneasy. A prickling sensation at the base of her spine spoke of change approaching, of fate shifting in ways she could not yet comprehend. The knock at her door came just past midnight. It was barely audible over the howling wind, a sound so faint Flora wondered if she had imagined it. When it came again, urgent and desperate, her heart leapt into her throat. No one called at such an hour unless catastrophe had struck. If stories of sacrifice, unexpected love, and the families we choose rather than inherit move your heart, subscribe now and stay with us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. Flora grabbed her shawl and hurried to the entrance, her bare feet cold against the stone floor. When she pulled open the heavy wooden door, the wind nearly tore it from her grasp. Standing on her threshold was a figure she recognized immediately, despite the darkness and the rain that plastered his hair to his skull. Richard Davenport, the Earl of Wyndham, stood before her in evening dress, now completely ruined by the storm. His coat hung heavy with water, his cravat had come undone, and his boots were caked in mud. He hesitated on the threshold, rain dripping from his coat, acutely aware of the impropriety of entering a widow's home at such an hour. But it was not his disheveled appearance or his hesitation that made Flora gasp and step backward in shock. It was the bundle he carried in his arms, wrapped in what appeared to be his own greatcoat. A bundle that moved. A bundle from which came the thin, reedy cry of a newborn infant. "Mrs. Sutton," the Earl said. His voice was hoarse and desperate in a way Flora had never heard from any nobleman. "Please, I need your help. I am begging you." Flora's mind raced even as her body moved on instinct. She stepped aside to allow him entry, knowing the scandal could ruin her, but unable to turn away a child in a storm. The Earl of Wyndham did not beg. The Earl of Wyndham did not appear at widows' cottages in the middle of winter storms. The Earl of Wyndham most certainly did not carry newborn babies through tempests in the dead of night. "Come in," Flora managed. She closed the door against the wind with a heavy thud. "Quickly by the fire. You will catch your death." The Earl moved to her hearth with the careful steps of a man carrying something infinitely precious. Flora lit a rushlight with trembling hands, the tallow dip sputtering before catching hold. In the dim, smoky light, she saw her sewing abandoned in her work basket where she had left it hours earlier. As the room brightened slightly, she could see him more clearly. What she saw made her chest tighten with something between pity and fear. This was not the composed, dignified Earl she had seen from a distance at church or riding through the village. This was a man on the edge of breaking. His face was haggard with exhaustion and grief. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a single night. "My lord," Flora said softly. She approached him with the caution one might use with a wounded animal. "What has happened? Whose child is this?" The Earl looked down at the bundle in his arms. Something in his expression shattered. When he raised his eyes to meet Flora's, she saw raw anguish there. It was the kind of pain that came from choices that could never be unmade and losses that could never be recovered. "She is mine," he said simply. "My daughter, but not my wife's child." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, heavy with implications that Flora's mind struggled to grasp. An illegitimate child, the Earl's illegitimate child, brought here to her cottage in the middle of the night. Her mother, the Earl continued, his voice breaking, was Miss Grace Harwell. She served as governess at Wyndham Hall for 3 years. She was kind and gentle and good, Mrs. Sutton. Better than I deserved. We loved each other, though we both knew such love was impossible. She died 2 hours ago, bringing this child into the world. I held her hand as she left it. Flora felt tears spring to her eyes, though she barely knew why. Perhaps it was the raw grief in the Earl's voice. Perhaps it was the way he held the baby so carefully, as if she were made of spun glass. Perhaps it was the tragedy of a woman dying in childbirth while bringing forth life, a fate Flora herself had narrowly escaped twice during her brief marriage. "I am so sorry," Flora whispered. She meant it with every fiber of her being. "Truly, my lord, that is a terrible loss." "My wife knows," the Earl said abruptly. Now Flora heard something else in his voice. Fear. "Lady Philippa discovered the pregnancy 3 months ago. She has been waiting and watching. When the midwife came running to inform me that Miss Harwell was in labor and in distress, my wife followed me to the cottage where Grace lay dying. She witnessed everything." The baby whimpered. The Earl began to rock her gently, the motion instinctive despite his obvious inexperience. Flora watched, transfixed by the sight of this powerful nobleman reduced to such vulnerable humanity. "Lady Philippa told me, with perfect coldness, that this child would not survive the night," the Earl continued, his jaw tight. "She said it would be a mercy. She claimed that bastards born of sin and shame should not be permitted to live and complicate the succession. She said she would see to it personally that the problem was solved." Horror washed through Flora like ice water. She threatened the child's life? "She did more than threaten," the Earl said bitterly. "She ordered our steward to take the baby to the woods and leave her there, exposed to the elements. When I refused and took the child myself, she informed me that she would alert the magistrate that I had stolen property from Wyndham Hall. She would claim the child belonged to a tenant farmer and that I had abducted her in my grief-stricken madness." Flora pressed her hand to her mouth. Understanding dawned with sick clarity. "So you came here." "I came here because you are a widow," the Earl said. His voice took on a pleading quality that broke Flora's heart. "You are young enough that no one would question if you claim to have adopted an orphaned infant. You live alone, far enough from the hall that my wife's immediate influence does not reach. You have a good reputation in the village, Mrs. Sutton. People speak well of your character and your kindness." He stepped closer to her. Flora could see the desperation written in every line of his face. "I am begging you," he said quietly. "Save my daughter's life. Take her as your own. I will provide money, as much as you need. It will be delivered by the vicar as church charity, so it cannot be traced. I will never claim her publicly or endanger you by association. I ask only that you give her a chance to live, to grow, to have a life that her birth would otherwise deny her." Flora looked at the baby in his arms. She looked at the tiny face just visible within the folds of the greatcoat. The infant was sleeping now, her small chest rising and falling with breaths so delicate they seemed impossible. She was perfect, completely, utterly perfect, despite the circumstances of her creation and the hatred that threatened her existence. Panic flared briefly in Flora's chest. How would she feed another mouth when her own stores were so low? But then she looked at the child again. She knew she would starve herself before she let this innocent creature suffer. "If I refuse?" Flora asked. She already knew her answer. She had known it from the moment she had seen the Earl standing on her threshold with a child in his arms. "Then I will find another way," the Earl said. His voice held no conviction. "Though I do not know what that way might be. My wife controls Wyndham Hall absolutely in domestic matters. She has already turned the servants against me by claiming that grief over losing our longtime governess has driven me mad. If I try to place this child anywhere within my sphere of influence, Philippa will find out. She will send the child to a foundling hospital in London, or worse." He paused, He looked down at his daughter with such naked love that Flora had to look away from the intimacy of it. I would rather know she lives in poverty with a good woman than watch her die in wealth with my wife's hatred hovering over her, he finished quietly. Please, Mrs. Sutton, I am asking you to do something enormous, something that will change your life completely, but I have nowhere else to turn. Flora thought of her empty cottage. She thought of the 10 years she had spent alone since her husband's death. She thought of the children she had never had, and the babies she had lost before they could draw breath. She thought of Grace Harwell dying alone while bringing life into a world that would reject that life immediately. She thought of what kind of woman would threaten an innocent infant. She thought of what kind of man would brave a winter storm to save his daughter from that woman's cruelty. "What is her name?" Flora asked. The Earl blinked. He seemed surprised by the question. "She has none yet. Grace did not live long enough to name her formally, but just before the end, she whispered that she hoped the child would be wise enough to survive this world." Flora stepped forward. She gently pulled back the edge of the greatcoat to see the baby's face more clearly. The infant had dark hair, thick and soft. When she stirred in her sleep, Flora glimpsed eyes that would likely be gray when they opened. She had her father's chin. Something about her nose suggested she might have inherited her mother's features there. "Sophie," Flora said softly. "Her name should be Sophie. It means wisdom. It is what her mother wished for her." The Earl's eyes filled with tears. He bowed his head. "Sophie," he repeated. "Yes, that is perfect. Thank you, Mrs. Sutton. Thank you for giving her even that much, her name and dignity." "Give her to me," Flora said. She held out her arms. The Earl hesitated. His grip tightened on his daughter for just a moment. Then, with visible effort, he placed the tiny bundle into Flora's waiting embrace. The baby weighed almost nothing. She was warm and alive and utterly dependent. Flora felt something shift in her chest. It was a door opening that she had thought sealed forever. "I will love her," Flora promised. She looked up at the Earl. "I will raise her as my own. I will give her everything I have to give and protect her with my life if necessary. But you must swear to me, my lord, that you will never endanger her by claiming her publicly. If your wife is as dangerous as you say, then Sophie's only safety lies in remaining invisible to that woman's hatred." "I swear it," the Earl said immediately. "No one will ever know she is mine except you and I. To the world, she will be an orphan you took in out of Christian charity." Flora nodded slowly. "Then we have an understanding. But know this, Lord Wyndham. From this moment forward, she is my daughter, in all the ways that matter. You may have given her life, but I will give her a life worth living." "I would expect nothing less," the Earl said. "You are a good woman, Flora Sutton. Better than I deserve, certainly." He reached into his sodden coat and withdrew a heavy purse. He set it on Flora's table with the heavy thud of gold, looking at the money with deep shame. "There are 50 guineas here. This will help with immediate needs. More will come through the vicar, sent anonymously. If you ever need anything, leave a message at the church marked for the Earl's attention, and I will see that it is handled." Flora looked at the purse but did not touch it yet. "You may visit," she said quietly. "Not often, and never in ways that would draw attention. But a child should know her father, even if she cannot know the truth of her parentage. You may come as a distant relation, checking on a ward, perhaps an uncle or family friend." The Earl's face transformed with gratitude and something that looked almost like hope. "You would permit that?" "I would require it," Flora said firmly. "You have chosen to save her life, Lord Wyndham. Do not compound that choice by abandoning her entirely. She will need to see that the world contains good men as well as cruel women." "I will come," the Earl promised, "as often as I dare without endangering her safety." He lingered for a moment more. His eyes were on the sleeping baby in Flora's arms, as if trying to memorize her face. Then he turned and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. "Mrs. Sutton," he said without looking back, "when she is old enough to ask about her parents, will you tell her that her mother loved her? That Grace wanted nothing more than to hold her and see her grow?" Flora's throat tightened. "I will tell her. I promise." The Earl nodded once. Then he pulled open the door and stepped back into the storm. Flora watched him disappear into the darkness. He was swallowed by rain and wind and the weight of choices that could never be undone. Then she closed the door and turned back to the warm cottage and the baby in her arms. Sophie had awakened and was looking up at her with unfocused eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing at once. "Well then, little one," Flora whispered. She touched the baby's soft cheek with one gentle finger. "It seems fate has brought us together in the strangest of ways, but we shall make the best of it, you and I. I shall teach you to be strong and kind and brave, and you shall teach me, I think, how to be a mother." Sophie made a small sound. It was not quite a cry, but a kind of query, as if asking a question she did not yet have words to form. Flora smiled, despite the tears that slipped down her own cheeks. "Yes," she said softly. "I know it will not be easy, but the best things in life rarely are. Come now, let us see about getting you properly fed and settled. Tomorrow we shall tell the village that I have adopted an orphaned infant whose mother died in childbirth, and tomorrow your new life truly begins." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Flora's cottage, in the circle of firelight and warmth, a new kind of family had just been born. The weeks that followed Sophie's arrival transformed Flora's existence in ways both exhausting and exhilarating. The baby was healthy despite her dramatic entrance into the world, but she required constant attention. Feeding was a particular challenge. Flora had to painstakingly dilute milk from the goat she kept in the small woodshed, mixing it with boiled water and a touch of sugar, then feeding Sophie drop by drop with a silver spoon until the child learned to swallow. Flora found herself awake more often than not. She spent the fretful hours between midnight and dawn changing linens that seemed to dirty themselves with miraculous speed and rocking Sophie by the hearth. The village of Willowmere accepted Flora's story without much questioning. Widows sometimes took in orphaned children, especially those with no family of their own, to fill the empty spaces in their homes. Mrs. Harding from the bakery brought bread and offered advice gleaned from raising 6 children. Old Mr. Wickham from the village shop extended credit for necessary supplies, refusing to take payment until Flora was more settled. "A child is a blessing," he said gruffly when Flora tried to insist on immediate settlement of accounts. "The good Lord provides for those who care for his little ones." Flora accepted the help with gratitude, though she was careful not to appear too prosperous too quickly. The guineas the Earl had left, and the additional funds that arrived monthly through the vicar disguised as charitable donations, she used sparingly. She could not afford to draw attention to any sudden improvement in her circumstances. Sophie thrived under Flora's care. She grew from a tiny, fragile creature into a baby with strong lungs and a determined personality. By the time spring arrived and softened the harsh edges of winter, Sophie had learned to smile. It was a toothless grin that transformed her small face and made Flora's chest ache with love she had not known she possessed. It was late May when the Earl made his first visit since that storm-torn night. Flora had been expecting him, in a way, though she did not know precisely when he might appear. She was hanging washing in her garden when she heard the sound of horses approaching. She turned to see Lord Wyndham dismounting near her gate, accompanied by the village vicar to ensure propriety. He looked different in daylight and good weather. He was more composed than he had been that desperate night. But when his eyes found Sophie, sleeping peacefully in a basket beneath the apple tree, Flora saw the same raw emotion that had marked his face in her cottage. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Sutton," he said formally. His gaze never left the baby. "I hope I am not intruding. The vicar and I wish to inquire after your health, and that of your ward." "Not at all, my lord," Flora replied, understanding the game they would need to play. "Please, come and see her. She has grown considerably since she came to me." The Earl approached the basket with the careful steps of a pilgrim approaching a shrine. He knelt in the grass beside his daughter. Flora watched his face transform as he studied Sophie's sleeping features. "She is beautiful," he said quietly. "She looks healthy and content." "She is both," Flora assured him. "A good baby, all things considered. She sleeps well enough and feeds without difficulty now." The Earl reached out. He hesitated, then gently touched Sophie's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around his thumb. Flora saw him draw in a sharp breath. "Does she have everything she needs?" he asked. His voice was rough. "Are you managing well enough?" "We manage very well," Flora said truthfully. "The village has been kind, and the church charity has ensured we want for nothing essential." They stood in silence for several minutes, watching Sophie sleep. Flora noticed the tension in the Earl's shoulders. He held himself carefully, as if afraid that moving too freely might shatter the fragile peace of the moment. "My wife believes the child died," the Earl said finally. His voice was barely above a whisper so the vicar would not overhear. The midwife who attended Miss Harwell's labor was persuaded to say that the baby did not survive. "Philippa considers the matter closed." "And you?" Flora asked gently. "How do you bear it? Knowing your daughter lives but being unable to claim her?" The Earl's jaw tightened. "I bear it because I must, because the alternative is unthinkable. But I will not pretend it is easy, Mrs. Sutton. Looking at her, knowing she carries my blood and will never carry my name, is a particular form of torment. Knowing she will grow up believing I am nothing more than a distant relation who occasionally visits out of duty rather than love is harder still." Flora's chest tightened for him. She felt the weight of the impossible position he found himself in. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "Whatever pain you suffer now, it is better than the pain of having lost her entirely." "I know," the Earl said. "That knowledge is cold comfort in the small hours of the morning, but I know it nonetheless." Sophie stirred in her basket. She made small sounds that indicated she would wake soon. The Earl stepped back instinctively. Flora saw the struggle in his face, the desire to stay ward with the knowledge that he could not. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "I told my steward I was riding to inspect the northern fields. If I am gone too long, questions will be asked." "You are welcome to visit whenever you can do so safely," Flora said. "She should know you, even if she cannot know the truth." The Earl nodded. His eyes lingered on Sophie for one last moment. "Thank you, Mrs. Sutton, for everything. I shall return when I am able." He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Flora watched him go with mixed feelings. She understood his pain and even shared it to some degree. But Sophie was hers now, in all the ways that truly mattered. The Earl had made his choice that stormy night, and they all would live with the consequences. Flora lifted Sophie from her basket as the baby began to fuss. She settled her against her shoulder and swayed gently. "There now, little one," she murmured. "All is well. You are safe and loved, and that is all that matters." And for that moment, in the warmth of the spring afternoon, it was true. The years that followed fell into a pattern that felt almost natural, though Flora never forgot the unusual circumstances that had brought Sophie into her life. The Earl visited 4 or 5 times each year. He was always careful to bring the vicar or another respectable chaperone to silence the village gossips. He brought gifts that were thoughtful without being extravagant, books and toys that a concerned family friend might reasonably provide to a widow raising an orphaned child. Sophie grew into a bright, curious little girl with her father's gray eyes and a smile that could charm the sternest of hearts. She called Flora Mama from the moment she learned to speak. Flora's heart expanded to accommodate the fierce love she felt for this child who was hers in every way, except biology. The village adored Sophie. Mrs. Harding saved special pastries for her. Mr. Wickham let her play with the ribbons and buttons in his shop. The vicar's wife taught her letters and numbers during visits to the rectory. Flora made sure Sophie learned her manners and her place in the world, but she also made sure the child knew she was valued and precious. When Sophie turned 5 years old in the winter of 1820, Flora organized a small celebration at the cottage. She baked a cake sweetened with honey and invited a few of the village children to play games. The Earl, who had been informed of the date through their carefully maintained system of messages, arrived bearing a set of watercolors and fine paper. "For the birthday girl," he said. His formal manner dissolved into genuine warmth as Sophie threw her arms around his legs in delight. "I thought you might enjoy learning to paint." "Thank you, Uncle Richard," Sophie exclaimed. She used the title they had agreed upon. To the world, the Earl was a distant relation of Flora's late husband, kind enough to check on his widow and her adopted daughter from time to time. Flora watched them together. Sophie chattered happily about everything she had been learning, while the Earl listened with an attention that made Flora's throat constrict. This was the hardest part. It was not the exhaustion of raising a child alone, or the constant vigilance required to maintain their carefully constructed fiction. The hardest part was watching the Earl try to be both everything and nothing to his daughter, present but distant, loving but unable to claim that love. After the other children had left and Sophie was settled for a nap, exhausted from excitement, Flora made tea. She brought it to where the Earl sat by her fire. "She adores you," Flora said quietly. She handed him a cup. "She speaks of your visits for weeks after you leave." "The feeling is entirely mutual," the Earl said. He wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "These visits are the brightest moments in my life, Mrs. Sutton. Everything else feels gray and hollow by comparison." Flora heard something in his voice that made her look at him more carefully. He appeared tired, she realized. It was more than simple travel would account for. There were new lines around his eyes. His shoulders carried a weight that had not been there before. "How are matters at Wyndham Hall?" she asked carefully. The Earl's expression darkened. "As cold as ever. My wife and I barely speak unless necessity demands it. She has her life, and I have mine. We occupy the same space without truly sharing it. It is a particular kind of loneliness to be married yet entirely alone." Flora felt a surge of sympathy. "I am sorry. That cannot be easy." "It is the bargain I made," the Earl said with resignation. "Our marriage was arranged by our families when we were barely down from Oxford. Love was never part of the equation, though I hoped we might at least develop companionship over time. When that failed to materialize, I found what comfort I could elsewhere. Grace was kind and good. I like to think we brought each other some measure of happiness, however brief." He paused, his eyes distant. "Philippa has never forgiven me for that happiness, I think. Not because she wanted me for herself, but because she could not control it. My wife is a woman who needs absolute control over her domain. The existence of a bastard child, even one she believes dead, represents a chaos she cannot tolerate. Then it is good Sophie remains safely invisible to her," Flora said firmly. "The longer this secret holds, the safer we all are." "Indeed," the Earl agreed. "Though I confess, Mrs. Sutton, these visits grow more difficult with each passing year. Sophie is so alive, so full of joy and possibility. Returning to Wyndham Hall after seeing her feels like returning to a tomb." Flora reached out and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of comfort. A sudden electric shock seemed to pass between them. Flora snatched her hand back as if burned, acutely aware of the impropriety and the heat rising in her cheeks. The Earl looked at her, his eyes wide, the air between them suddenly charged with a dangerous possibility. "You gave her life twice over, my lord," Flora said hurriedly, her voice trembling slightly. "Once through birth, and once through the choice you made that night. That is something to hold on to when the weight grows too heavy. The Earl looked at her with an expression Flora could not quite read, though it made her heart race. "You are a remarkable woman, Flora Sutton," he said quietly. "I chose well when I came to your door that night, though I did not fully understand just how well." The silence stretched, filled with things that could not be said. Flora stood quickly. She busied herself with clearing the tea things. "Sophie will wake soon," she said, her voice perhaps a bit too bright. "She will want to try her new paints immediately, I expect. You should stay and help her if your time permits." "I should like that very much," the Earl said. The moment passed, though Flora felt its echo lingering long after he had ridden away at dusk. Over the next year, the Earl's visits became slightly more frequent. Flora found herself looking forward to them with an anticipation that had little to do with Sophie's delight and everything to do with the Earl himself. He was good company, she told herself, intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry wit that made her laugh and a kindness that seemed at odds with his position in society. She told herself it was friendship she felt, nothing more. But in the quiet hours after Sophie was asleep and the cottage was still, Flora sometimes allowed herself to remember the way the Earl looked at her. It was the warmth in his eyes that seemed to see past her status as a widow and into something deeper. It was foolishness, she knew. The Earl was married, however unhappily. She was a common widow raising his illegitimate child. There could be nothing between them beyond the careful dance they already performed. To imagine otherwise was to invite disaster. But the heart, Flora was learning, rarely listened to reason. It was in the spring of 1821, when Sophie was 6 years old and Flora was 34, that everything changed. The Earl had been expected for a visit. But when 3 weeks passed without word, Flora began to worry. It was unlike him to miss a planned visit without sending some kind of message through their established channels. Sophie asked after Uncle Richard daily, wondering when he would come to see her watercolor paintings. When a rider finally appeared at Flora's cottage, it was not the Earl, but his steward, Mr. Graves. He looked grim and uncomfortable. "Mrs. Sutton," he said. He dismounted quickly. "I bring difficult news. Lord Wyndham asked me to inform you that he will not be able to visit for some time. There has been an incident at Wyndham Hall that requires his constant attention." Flora's heart began to race. "What kind of incident? Is the Earl injured?" "Not precisely," Mr. Graves said carefully. He glanced around to ensure they were not overheard. "But Lady Philippa has become, shall we say, increasingly erratic in recent months. Her behavior has grown more volatile, and the Earl believes it is unsafe to leave the hall for any extended period." Flora felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "What has she done?" Mr. Graves hesitated. He was clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "I am not at liberty to discuss the details, ma'am, but the Earl wanted you to know that he thinks of you and young Sophie often and hopes to resume visits when circumstances permit." After the steward departed, Flora stood in her garden for a long time. She stared at nothing and felt afraid in ways she could not fully articulate. What had the Countess done? And more importantly, did it have anything to do with Sophie? The answer came 3 days later, though not from any source Flora could have anticipated. It was late afternoon. The village, usually full of the sounds of daily labor, fell into a sudden, unnatural hush. Then Flora heard it. The distinct rhythmic clatter of expensive horses and the heavy roll of a carriage, sounds rarely heard in Willowmere. Flora had been helping Sophie with her letters when the knock came at her door. It was hard and imperious. Flora opened it to find 2 men she did not recognize. They were dressed in the livery of Wyndham Hall. Behind them, seated in an elegant carriage, was Lady Philippa Davenport herself. Flora's blood turned to ice. In 6 years, the Countess had never come to Willowmere. She had never shown the slightest interest in the village or its inhabitants. Her presence here could mean only one thing. She knew. "Mrs. Flora Sutton?" one of the men asked formally. "I am she," Flora managed. Her mouth had gone dry. "Lady Philippa Davenport wishes to speak with you. You will come at once." It was not a request. Flora glanced back at Sophie, who had appeared in the doorway of the cottage. Her gray eyes were wide with confusion and a hint of fear. "May I bring my daughter?" Flora asked, though she knew the answer. "The child will remain here," the man said. "Mrs. Harding from the bakery has been asked to mind her. This will not take long." Flora had no choice. She kissed Sophie's forehead and whispered that all would be well, even though she did not believe it. Then she allowed herself to be handed into the carriage beside the Countess. Lady Philippa was beautiful, but she surveyed the interior of the carriage with a sneer, pulling her skirts away from Flora as if fearing contamination. Her features were exquisite, her dress impeccable, her posture flawless, but her eyes were hard as diamonds and just as sharp. When she looked at Flora, there was no warmth there at all. "Mrs. Sutton," the Countess said as the carriage lurched into motion, "I believe we have much to discuss." Flora said nothing. She waited for the blow to fall. "I have recently employed the services of a private agent," Lady Philippa continued. Her voice was smooth and cultured. "A man skilled in uncovering secrets that people foolishly believe buried. He has been most thorough in his work. Would you care to guess what he has discovered?" Flora's hands clenched in her lap, but she kept her face carefully neutral. "I cannot imagine, my lady." "No?" The Countess's smile was terrifying in its sweetness. "Let me enlighten you then. 6 years ago, my husband's former governess died in childbirth. The midwife was persuaded to report that the infant died as well. But the agent has spoken with several villagers who recall seeing my husband riding out into a winter storm that very night and returning hours later without explanation. They recall that shortly thereafter, you, a childless widow, suddenly acquired an orphaned baby girl." Lady Philippa leaned forward slightly, her eyes bored into Flora's. "The agent also discovered something quite interesting about the timelines involved. You see, Mrs. Sutton, I have seen records from the parish registry. There was no orphaned infant whose mother died in childbirth anywhere in this region during that winter. No family reported losing a daughter who left behind a child. The baby you claim to have adopted simply appeared in your cottage one night, as if conjured from thin air." Flora felt her world beginning to crumble. She fought to maintain her composure. "I do not know what you are implying, my lady." "Do not insult my intelligence by pretending ignorance," the Countess snapped. Her cultured facade cracked to reveal the rage beneath. "That child is my husband's bastard. The infant his whore of a governess whelped before she had the decency to die. My husband hid her with you, thinking I would never discover the truth. But I know everything now, Mrs. Sutton. Everything." The carriage had pulled to a stop in front of Wyndham Hall. It was imposing and beautiful in the afternoon light. Flora was escorted inside, down halls lined with portraits of Davenport ancestors who stared down at her with painted disapproval. They brought her to a drawing room where the Earl waited. His face was ashen when he saw her. In the corner of the room, almost invisible in the shadows, a young maid named Betty stood trembling, her eyes fixed on the floor. Lady Philippa swept in behind Flora, her skirts rustling with fury barely contained. "Richard," she said sweetly, though the sweetness was laced with venom. "Look what I have brought you, your little accomplice in deception. Shall we have the truth now, or shall we continue this farce?" The Earl looked at Flora. In his eyes, she saw apology and fear and resignation. "Philippa," he began. "Do not bother with denials," his wife interrupted. "I have proof enough to satisfy myself and anyone else who might be interested. I have waited 6 years for an heir, Richard. 6 years of failure while you secretly lavished attention on your bastard. I will not be replaced." She began to pace. Her movements were controlled but predatory. "You have humiliated me, Richard. You have made a mockery of our marriage and our name. But worse than that, you have allowed your bastard to live and thrive, a constant reminder that you have polluted the Davenport line with inferior blood." She is an innocent child, the Earl said. His voice was low and dangerous. Whatever anger you feel toward me, Philippa, leave the child out of it. Leave her out of it? Lady Philippa laughed. It was a sound like breaking glass. She is the very heart of it, husband. As long as she lives, she represents your infidelity and my failure to provide you with legitimate heirs. Do you know how society will react if this becomes known? Do you understand the scandal that will destroy us both? She stopped pacing and turned to face them both. Her expression was calculating. There is only one solution. The child must be removed, sent to a foundling hospital in the north, or perhaps shipped to the colonies where she will be forgotten and lost among thousands of other unwanted children. Mrs. Sutton will be compensated for her trouble and encouraged to relocate to another part of England, where she may start anew without the burden of another woman's mistake. No, Flora said. The word erupted from her before she could stop it. No, I will not give up Sophie. She is my daughter. She is not your daughter, Lady Philippa said coldly. She is a lie you have been living for 6 years, but that lie ends today. I will not allow it, the Earl said. He stepped forward. Philippa, I have endured much from you over the years. Your coldness, your contempt, your cruelty. But I will not stand by while you destroy an innocent child to satisfy your wounded pride. His wife's eyes flashed with fury. You have no choice in the matter. My family's connections run deep, Richard. I have the ear of powerful men who do not look kindly on bastards threatening legitimate lines. If you resist me, I will destroy you. If you harm that child, the Earl said quietly, and there was steel in his voice that made even the Countess pause. If you lay one finger on her or arrange for any harm to come to her, I will destroy you, Philippa. I will petition Parliament for a divorce, citing your cruelty and your threats against an innocent. I will lay bare every private disgrace our marriage has accumulated. I will make sure that everyone knows exactly what kind of woman you are. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Divorce was scandalous, nearly impossible to obtain, and ruinous for all parties involved. It would cost a fortune in bribes and political favors. But Flora could see that the Earl meant every word. Lady Philippa's face had gone white, then red with rage. You would not dare. The scandal would destroy you as surely as it would destroy me. Try me, the Earl said softly. I have nothing left to lose, Philippa. You have already taken everything else. My pride, my peace, any hope of happiness within these walls. Sophie is all I have that matters. Touch her, and I will burn down everything we have built. Damn the consequences. Flora watched this exchange with a mixture of terror and hope. She had never seen the Earl like this, stripped of his careful politeness and revealing the steel underneath. But Lady Philippa was not finished. Her eyes gleamed with malice as she reached into her reticule and withdrew something that made Flora's breath hitch. It was a pearl necklace. It was beautiful and obviously expensive. The Countess held it up so they both could see it clearly. This necklace, Lady Philippa said slowly, belongs to my personal collection. It was a gift from my mother on my wedding day. I discovered it missing from my jewel case 3 days ago. She turned to Flora. Her smile was terrifying. And this afternoon, while you were being brought here, my men searched your cottage. Imagine my shock when they discovered this very necklace hidden among your belongings. You are a thief, Mrs. Sutton, a common criminal who took advantage of my husband's charity to steal from his household. Flora felt the ground drop away beneath her feet. That is a lie. I have never been inside Wyndham Hall, let alone near your jewel case. You planted that necklace yourself. Can you prove that? The Countess asked sweetly. Or will it be your word against mine? The word of a widow of no particular standing against the word of a countess? The Earl's face had gone dangerously calm. You planted evidence to frame an innocent woman. That is beyond cruelty, Philippa. That is criminal. Call it what you like, his wife said dismissively. The magistrate will see a clear case of theft. Mrs. Sutton will be arrested and tried. Her adopted daughter will be sent to the foundling hospital while her false mother serves time in prison. And you, my dear husband, will have no one to blame but yourself for bringing this woman into our lives in the first place." Flora felt her world shattering into pieces. Sophie, her beautiful, innocent Sophie, sent to a hospital where children lived in filth and died of disease. The thought was unbearable. "Please," Flora heard herself say. She hated the desperation in her voice but was unable to stop it. "Please, I will do whatever you want. I will leave. Take nothing with me. Never speak of any of this again. Just do not hurt Sophie. She has done nothing wrong." "How touching," Lady Philippa said mockingly. "But I am afraid your pleas come too late. The magistrate has already been summoned." The hours that followed were an agony of silence. The Earl stood by the fireplace, a muscle feathering in his jaw. Lady Philippa sat with supreme confidence, sipping tea. Flora stood, refusing to sit, praying as she had never prayed before. When the magistrate finally arrived, the sun had set. He was a stern man who looked from the necklace to Flora with grave suspicion. Lady Philippa told her story with practiced ease. The magistrate examined the pearls, shaking his head at the audacity of such a theft. The Earl moved suddenly. He placed himself between Flora and the magistrate. "This ends now, Philippa. You will not destroy these people to satisfy your vendetta against me." "You cannot stop me," the Countess said. But for the first time, a note of uncertainty had crept into her voice. "I can," the Earl said, "and I will." What happened next would become legend in the village of Willowmere and the subject of scandal throughout all of Kent. The Earl turned to the magistrate. In a voice that rang with authority, he accused his wife of planting evidence to frame an innocent woman, of threatening the life of a child, of cruelty beyond measure. Lady Philippa denied everything, of course. But the Earl was relentless. He produced evidence of his own, records he had kept over the years documenting his wife's cold treatment of servants and her vindictive behavior. And then, incredibly, the young maid in the corner stepped forward. Betty, barely 16 years old and trembling violently, admitted in a whisper that she had seen Lady Philippa the previous afternoon. She had seen the Countess packing a pearl necklace into a cloth bag and leaving the hall with her two most trusted footmen. "She told me it was for a charitable donation," Betty said, her voice barely audible. "But I heard her tell the footman to hide it in the widow's cottage when they went to fetch Mrs. Sutton. I heard her say that this would finally solve the problem once and for all." The confession hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Lady Philippa turned on the maid with fury, but it was too late. The truth, once spoken, could not be unspoken. The magistrate found himself confronted not with evidence of theft by a widow, but evidence of a far more serious crime. Planting false evidence was itself illegal, and threatening a child's life was unconscionable. The investigation that followed would reveal more ugliness than anyone had anticipated. It would take time, but in the end, the Earl would do exactly what he had threatened. He would petition Parliament for divorce. It was a rare and scandalous proceeding that would drag every terrible detail of his marriage into public view. It cost him a fortune in legal fees and political capital, nearly bankrupting the estate. Lady Philippa's cruelty, her vindictiveness, her attempted frame of an innocent woman, and her threats against a child, all of it became part of the permanent record. The divorce was granted, though it took 2 years and cost the Earl much of his standing in society. Some nobles cut him entirely, viewing his actions as a betrayal of his class. Others privately admired his courage in choosing justice over convenience. Lady Philippa was exiled to France, where she lived on a modest allowance far from the society that had once elevated her. She would die there, alone and bitter, 10 years later. But in the immediate aftermath of that terrible afternoon at Wyndham Hall, Flora found herself free to return home to Sophie. The child had been terrified by the strange men and the long absence of the woman she called Mama. "You came back," Sophie said. She threw herself into Flora's arms with such force that they both nearly toppled over. "I was so scared." "I know, my darling," Flora said. She held her daughter tight. "I know, but it is over now. We are safe." The Earl had accompanied her home. He stood awkwardly in the cottage that had become Sophie's world. The little girl looked at him with her gray eyes, so like his own. She seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted. "Uncle Richard," she said seriously, "are you staying for supper? Mama is going to make stew." The Earl looked at Flora. In his eyes she saw a question he did not yet know how to ask. She smiled, just a little, and nodded. "Yes, Sophie," she said quietly. "Uncle Richard is staying for supper, and I think we all have much to discuss." It was the beginning, Flora thought, of something new. Something that would take time and patience to build, but which had always been waiting just beneath the surface of their careful lies. It was the beginning of truth. The 2 years that followed the confrontation at Wyndham Hall were strange and difficult in ways Flora had not fully anticipated. The Earl's petition for divorce became the scandal of the county, then the scandal of half of England. Every sordid detail was examined and discussed in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs from Kent to Scotland. The ton was divided in its opinions. Some viewed the Earl as a hero who had stood up to a cruel woman and protected the innocent. Others saw him as a man who had betrayed his marriage vows and then compounded the sin by exposing private matters in the most public way possible. Women whispered about poor Lady Philippa, forced from her home by an unfaithful husband. Men muttered about the Earl's weakness in allowing a woman to drive him to such extremes. Through it all, Flora and Sophie remained in their cottage in Willowmere. They tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy while the world around them shifted and reformed. The Earl visited more openly now, no longer constrained by the need to hide his interest in Sophie's welfare. He began to teach her to ride, bringing a gentle mare from Wyndham Hall. He read to her from books of poetry and history. He brought her small gifts that made her eyes light up with joy. And slowly, carefully, he and Flora began to navigate a new kind of understanding. They were not quite friends, though friendship was part of it. They were not quite family, though Sophie bound them together in ways that felt familial. They existed in a space that had no clear definition, waiting for the legal machinery of divorce to grind through its interminable processes. It was during this time that Flora began to realize the depth of her feelings for Richard Davenport. Not the Earl, distant and untouchable, but the man himself. She saw his kindness in the way he gently corrected Sophie's posture on horseback. She saw his intelligence in the conversations they had while Sophie played nearby. She saw his wounded heart in the moments when he thought no one was watching, when grief and loneliness crossed his face like shadows. They never touched. They never spoke of the affection growing between them. The proprieties had to be observed, especially with the divorce pending. But in the glances they exchanged, in the way the air seemed to thicken when they were near each other, a fierce yearning began to take root. It was a hunger born of shared trauma and mutual respect. She told herself it was impossible. Even when the divorce was final, the gulf between them was too wide to cross. He was an Earl. She was a widow of no particular standing. Society would never accept such a union. But the heart, as Flora had learned long ago, rarely listened to reason. The divorce was finalized in the spring of 1823. Richard Davenport was a free man, though the freedom came at a cost. Many of his former friends had distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with the divorced man. His family connections were strained nearly to breaking. The scandal would follow him for years, possibly for the rest of his life. Flora expected him to retreat from Willowmere. She thought he would return to Wyndham Hall and try to rebuild his life in isolation. Instead, he appeared at her cottage one warm May afternoon and asked if they might take a walk. They left Sophie with Mrs. Harding, who had become something of a grandmother figure to the little girl. They walked toward the stream that ran through the meadow beyond the village. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They were content to simply exist in each other's presence. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Flora," he said. It was the first time he had used her Christian name without the formality of Mrs. Sutton attached. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, without concern for propriety or what you think I wish to hear." Flora felt her pulse begin to race, though she kept her voice calm. "Of course." Richard stopped walking and turned to face her fully. In the afternoon light, she could see every line that the past years had etched into his face, every mark of the suffering he had endured and the courage he had found to endure it. "These past 2 years," he began carefully, "spending time with you and with Sophie, have been the happiest of my life. Not simply because I have been able to know my daughter, though that has been a gift beyond measure, but because of you, Flora. Your strength, your kindness, your ability to find joy, even in difficult circumstances. You have taught me what it means to build a life of purpose and meaning, even when the world offers only judgment and hardship." He paused. Flora saw him gathering his courage for what came next. "I am a divorced man," he continued. "A scandal. Many doors are closed to me now, and they will remain closed. I can offer you no grand entry into society, no glittering position among the ton. I can offer you only myself, flawed and damaged as I am, and a life that will always carry the shadow of what came before." Richard took her hands in his. His grip was warm and steady. "But if you will have me, Flora Sutton, I would like to offer you that life. I would like to marry you. I want to make our little family legal and real and whole. I would like to wake each morning knowing that you are my wife, that Sophie is our daughter together, that we need no longer hide behind careful fictions and half-truths." Flora felt tears spring to her eyes, though she was smiling. "Richard," she whispered, "I am not of your world. I can never be the kind of wife an Earl should have. I know nothing of managing great estates or hosting grand parties. I can barely manage my own cottage." "I do not want a manager of estates," Richard said firmly. "I have a steward for that. I want a companion who knows how to make a house a home. I lived in cold splendor for years, Flora, surrounded by marble and silk, but starving for warmth. I do not want a hostess. I want a wife who can teach me to laugh again, who can show Sophie what it means to be strong and good in a world that is not always kind. I want you, Flora, exactly as you are." "The scandal will never fully fade," Flora said. Her objections felt weak even to her own ears. "People will always talk. They will say terrible things about us, about Sophie." "Let them talk," Richard said. "I have learned something in these past years, Flora. I have learned that the opinion of people who value reputation over righteousness is worth less than nothing. The people who matter, the people whose judgment is worth heeding, those people have stood by us. The rest can go hang." Flora laughed, despite the tears streaming down her face. "That is very unbecoming language for an Earl. Then it is a good thing I am speaking as Richard, not as the Earl of Wyndham," he said, smiling. "So, what do you say, Flora Sutton? Will you marry a scandalous, divorced Earl who comes with more baggage than any reasonable woman should accept? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the gift you gave me when you opened your door on that storm-filled night 8 years ago?" Flora looked at him. She looked at this man who had chosen his daughter's life over his own comfort. He had faced down his wife's cruelty even when it cost him everything. He had rebuilt himself from the ashes of a broken marriage into someone capable of real love and real courage. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Richard Davenport. Not because you are an Earl, but because you are a good man who taught me that it is never too late to choose love over fear." Richard pulled her into his arms. He held her as if she were something infinitely precious. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "Thank you for saving my daughter. Thank you for saving me." They stood there for a long time. They held each other beside the stream while the spring breeze rustled through the new leaves and carried with it the promise of better days ahead. When they finally returned to the cottage, Sophie looked up from the drawing she had been working on. She studied them both with the solemn wisdom that sometimes appeared in children. "You are going to get married," she announced, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Uncle Richard is going to be my papa." Flora and Richard exchanged startled glances, then began to laugh. "Yes, darling," Flora said. She knelt beside her daughter. "How did you know?" Sophie rolled her eyes in the way only an 8-year-old could manage. "Because you are both smiling like Mrs. Harding when she makes spiced buns. And Uncle Richard is holding your hand. People only hold hands like that when they love each other." "You are too clever by half," Richard said. He reached out to ruffle Sophie's dark hair. "Yes, we are going to be married. How do you feel about that?" Sophie considered the question seriously. "Will I call you Papa?" "If you would like to," Richard said. His voice was suddenly thick with emotion. "I would be honored if you did." "And will we live at the big house?" Sophie asked. "The one with all the gardens?" "We will live wherever makes your mother happiest," Richard said, looking at Flora. Flora thought about her small cottage, the only home she had known for more than a decade. Then she thought about Wyndham Hall. It was vast and beautiful, and full of empty rooms that could be filled with life and laughter and love. "The big house," she said finally. "But we keep this cottage too. We will need a place to escape to when society becomes too tiresome." "Agreed," Richard said, grinning. "Though I suspect you will transform Wyndham Hall in ways that make escape unnecessary." They were married 6 weeks later in the small church at Willowmere. It was not the grand society wedding an Earl might have had under different circumstances. There were no titled guests, no elaborate preparations, no announcements in the London papers. But the church was full of villagers who had come to witness the union of their widow and the Earl who had chosen honor over convenience. Sophie stood beside them. She was solemn and beautiful in a new dress that Richard had commissioned from the finest dressmaker in the county. When the rector pronounced them husband and wife, Sophie clapped her hands together with such obvious delight that the entire congregation laughed. As they walked out of the church into the June sunshine, Flora saw some of the villagers crying. They were overcome with emotion at the fairy tale ending they had witnessed. Mrs. Harding pressed a package of wedding cakes into Flora's hands. Mr. Wickham gruffly wished them happiness. Young Betty, the maid who had testified against Lady Philippa, threw flower petals in their path. That evening, after the simple celebration feast, and after Sophie had been put to bed in her new room at Wyndham Hall, Richard and Flora stood together in the gallery overlooking the gardens. The house felt different than it had on Flora's previous visit. It was warmer somehow, as if the very walls sensed that things had changed. "I have something for you," Richard said. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small box. He opened it to reveal a ring, simple but beautiful, set with a single sapphire. It was my grandmother's. She was a remarkable woman who married for love despite her family's objections. I thought you might appreciate the history. Flora allowed him to slip the ring onto her finger. She marveled at how perfectly it fit. "It is beautiful. Thank you." "No," Richard said. He took both her hands in his. "Thank you. For taking a risk on a desperate man 8 years ago. For loving my daughter as your own. For teaching me that it is possible to build something good from the wreckage of what came before. You have given me more than I ever deserved, Flora Davenport." Flora smiled at the sound of her new name. "We have given each other everything that matters. The rest is just details." They stood together in the growing dusk. They looked out over the gardens that would soon be Sophie's playground, the estate that would become their shared responsibility, the future that stretched before them full of possibility. It would not be easy, Flora knew. There would always be those who whispered and judged. There would always be reminders of how unconventional their family was. But they had survived worse than whispers. They had survived storms and cruelty and the weight of impossible choices. They would survive this too, together. The years that followed were among the most fulfilling of Flora's life. Wyndham Hall was transformed from a cold, unwelcoming place into a home that buzzed with activity and warmth. Flora hired new staff who were chosen for their kindness as much as their competence. She opened parts of the house that had been closed for years. She filled the rooms with flowers and light, and the sound of Sophie's laughter echoing through the corridors. Richard proved to be an attentive and loving husband. He valued her opinions on everything from estate management to the education of the local children. He encouraged her to pursue her interests, establishing a school in Willowmere where children from all backgrounds could learn to read and write. He defended the school fiercely against critics who claimed educating the poor would lead to unrest, arguing that ignorance was a far greater danger than knowledge. Sophie blossomed under their care. She was designated as Richard's legal ward and primary heir when she turned 10, securing her future in all official records. The arrangement was unusual, certainly, but no more unusual than anything else about their family. Sophie bore the speculation and whispers with the same grace her mother displayed, understanding that some truths were more important than what society deemed proper. On Sophie's 10th birthday, Richard and Flora decided the time had come to tell her the full truth of her origins. They gathered in the library. Sophie sat between them on the settee while they explained everything. The storm-filled night, Grace Harwell's death, Lady Philippa's threats, the years of careful deception. Sophie listened in silence. Her gray eyes were wide, taking it all in. When they finished, she sat quietly for several moments, processing. Finally, she looked at Richard. "So you are my real father," she said slowly, "not my uncle." "Yes," Richard said, his voice gentle. "I am your father, Sophie. I have always been your father, though I could not claim you as such for many years." Sophie turned to Flora. "And you are not my real mother. My real mother was someone named Grace who died when I was born." Flora's chest clenched, but she forced herself to answer honestly. "Grace Harwell gave birth to you, yes. She loved you, Sophie, even though she never got to hold you. But I have been your mother in every way that matters since you were just a few hours old." Sophie looked between them. Her young face was serious. Then, with the wisdom that children sometimes possess in abundance, she said something that made both adults' eyes fill with tears. "I think I had two mothers," Sophie said firmly. "One who gave me life, and one who gave me everything else. And now I have a father who loved me enough to save me, and a mother who loved me enough to risk everything for me. I think that makes me very lucky." She paused, then added with typical childish practicality, "Though I would still like a little brother or sister, if that is possible." Richard and Flora burst out laughing. The tension of the moment broke like a soap bubble. "We shall see what we can do," Flora said. She hugged her daughter close. "We shall certainly see." As it happened, Sophie got her wish. Over the next 5 years, 3 more children were born to Richard and Flora. 2 boys and a girl, each of whom grew up knowing their older sister's unusual story and loving her fiercely because of it, not in spite of it. Sophie grew into a confident, intelligent young woman who inherited her father's determination and her mother's compassion. When she came of age, several respectable young men expressed interest in courting her, despite the whispers about her origins. She eventually chose a kind-hearted baron's son who loved her for exactly who she was, origins and all. He married her despite stiff opposition from his own family, proving himself worthy of the Davenport legacy. On Sophie's wedding day, Flora stood with Richard watching their daughter take her vows. She found herself thinking about that storm-filled night 18 years earlier. She thought about the desperate man who had appeared at her door with a baby in his arms. She thought about all the ways that single night had transformed multiple lives, spinning out in ripples that touched more people than they could have ever imagined. "What are you thinking about?" Richard murmured. He took her hand. "That I am glad it rained that night," Flora said simply. "That I am glad you chose my door to knock on. That I am glad we were both brave enough to choose love when the world told us to choose safety." Richard smiled and raised her hand to his lips. "As am I, though I suspect the choice was never really ours to make. Some things are simply meant to be, regardless of how impossible they seem at the time." Sophie turned to look at them from the altar. Her face was radiant with happiness. She mouthed the words, "I love you." Flora felt her throat tighten with emotion, marveling at the journey that had brought them all to this moment. That evening, after the wedding celebration had concluded and the newlyweds had departed, Flora and Richard found themselves alone in the gardens of Wyndham Hall. The summer air was warm and sweet, with the scent of late-blooming roses that had survived a harsh spring. Somewhere in the house, their 3 younger children were being put to bed by their devoted nurse. "Do you ever regret it?" Flora asked quietly. "Giving up your position in society for this life?" Richard pulled her close. He wrapped his arms around her in a gesture that had become comfortable and familiar over the years. "Not for a single moment. The life I had before was hollow, Flora. Beautiful on the surface, but empty underneath. This life, with you and our children, this is real. This matters. I would choose it 1,000 times over." Flora leaned into his embrace. She felt the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "I love you," she said simply. "I do not think I have ever told you that directly, without caveats or qualifications. But I do. I love you, Richard Davenport, with everything I am." "And I love you," Richard replied. His voice was rough with emotion. "You saved my daughter's life that night. But more than that, you saved mine. You showed me what it means to live with courage and compassion and grace. You are the most remarkable person I have ever known." They stood together in the gathering darkness. They held each other as they had that day by the stream when Richard had first proposed. The years had changed them both, adding silver to Richard's hair and lines around Flora's eyes. But the love between them had only grown stronger, deepened by shared challenges and shared joys. Inside the house, their children slept soundly, safe and loved. In a cottage across the county, Sophie and her new husband were beginning their own journey together, carrying forward the lessons of courage and compassion they had learned from watching their parents build something beautiful from impossible circumstances. And in the gardens of Wyndham Hall, an Earl and his wife stood together in the twilight. They were grateful for storms and desperate choices and the families we choose rather than inherit. Some stories, Flora thought, had endings that felt like beginnings. Some endings were really just the start of something better. This was one of those stories. 10 years after Sophie's wedding, Flora sat in the drawing room at Wyndham Hall working on correspondence for the school, which had grown into a small network of institutions serving hundreds of children throughout Kent. She was 52 years old now. Her hair was more silver than brown, but she felt more content and purposeful than she had at any other point in her life. Richard entered the room. He moved a bit more slowly than he once had at 62, but he was still vital and present. He carried a letter in his hand. His expression was unreadable. "What is it?" Flora asked. She set down her pen. "A letter from France," Richard said slowly. "From Lady Philippa's solicitor. She died 3 weeks ago, pneumonia apparently." Flora felt a complicated mix of emotions. She had not thought about Philippa Davenport in years, though she knew Richard occasionally received reports about his former wife's circumstances. "I am sorry," Flora said, though she was not entirely certain what she was sorry for. The waste of a life, perhaps. The bitterness that had consumed Philippa until the end. "I am not," Richard said bluntly. He sat beside Flora. "I know I should be, but I cannot find it in myself to mourn her. She tried to destroy an innocent child. She tried to destroy you. She spent her entire life spreading cruelty wherever she went. The world is not worse off without her in it." No one deserves to die alone and bitter, Flora said gently. No, Richard agreed. But she chose that path, Flora. We offered her opportunities to change, to accept reality and move forward. She rejected everyone. In the end, we are all the authors of our own fate. She built hers out of spite and pride. The collapse was inevitable. They sat in silence for a few moments. They contemplated mortality and choices and the different paths lives could take. I want to tell you something, Richard said finally. Something I have never said directly, though I hope you have known it all these years. Flora looked at him. She saw the man she had built a life with, the father of her children, the companion in all things that mattered. That night I came to your door with Sophie, Richard continued. I thought I was asking you to save my daughter's life. And you did that, beyond any question. But you did something else as well, something I did not even know I needed. You saved my life too, Flora. You showed me what real courage looks like, what real love looks like. You taught me that titles and positions and society's approval mean nothing compared to doing what is right and protecting those who cannot protect themselves. He took her hands in his. His grip was still strong despite the years. Every good thing in my life since that night has come from the choice you made to open your door and take in a desperate man and his infant daughter. Our family, our children, the work you have done to help other vulnerable children, all of it flows from that one act of courage and compassion. Flora felt tears prick her eyes. I did not feel courageous that night. I felt terrified. Courage is not the absence of fear, Richard said softly. It is acting despite fear. You have shown me that truth again and again, and I am grateful for it every single day. They sat together in the afternoon light. They held hands and contemplated the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this place. Outside, they could hear the sounds of their youngest son playing in the gardens. His laughter carried through the open windows. Do you think Sophie understands? Flora asked quietly. What a gift she has been to all of us. I think she does, Richard said. She has seen what love and family can accomplish. She has seen that the circumstances of our birth matter far less than the choices we make with our lives. When she looks at her own children, I think she understands exactly how much she has been loved and valued, despite everything. Flora smiled, thinking of her grandchildren. Sophie had 3 children now and was expecting a 4th. The eldest, a boy of 7 named Richard after his grandfather, had his great-grandmother Grace's gentle nature and his mother's determination. We have been fortunate, Flora said. Despite everything, we have been enormously fortunate. We have, Richard agreed, though I would argue we made much of our own fortune through the choices we made. Fate brought us together, but we built this life together through determination and love and refusing to let the world tell us what was possible. He was right, Flora thought. The world had told them that an earl and a widow could never build a family together. The world had told them that an illegitimate child could never find acceptance and happiness. The world had told them that choosing love over duty was foolish and doomed to fail. They had proven the world wrong in every way that mattered. That evening, the entire family gathered for dinner at Wyndham Hall. Sophie and her husband had come for a visit with their children. Richard and Flora's other 3 children were there with their respective families. The dining room was full of conversation and laughter and the happy chaos of multiple generations sharing a meal. At one point, young Richard climbed onto Flora's lap and asked her to tell him a story. Flora looked around the table at all the faces she loved. She looked at the family that had been built from such impossible circumstances and smiled. Let me tell you, she began, about a night when it rained so hard it seemed like the world might wash away. About a man brave enough to save his daughter at any cost. About a woman who chose compassion over caution. And about a baby who grew up to be loved beyond measure. The children settled in to listen, even though many of them had heard versions of this story before. The adults grew quiet too. They understood that this was more than just a tale. It was their history, their foundation, the story that explained how they had all come to be sitting around this table together. As Flora spoke, Richard watched her with eyes full of love and gratitude. When she finished, Sophie stood and raised her glass in a toast. "To family," Sophie said. Her voice carried clearly through the room. "Not the family we are born into, but the family we choose and build together through love and sacrifice and determination. To my mother, who showed me that the strongest bonds are forged by choice, not blood. And to my father, who taught me that courage sometimes means making the hardest decisions for the sake of those we love." "To family," everyone echoed, glasses raised. Later, after the guests had departed and the house had grown quiet, Flora and Richard prepared for bed. As they had done for nearly 30 years, they helped each other with the small rituals of nighttime preparation, comfortable in the intimacy of long companionship. "Do you know what I wish?" Flora said as they settled into bed. "What is that?" Richard asked. He pulled her close. "I wish I could go back to that night, to the frightened widow standing at her door, staring at a desperate Earl with a baby in his arms. I wish I could tell her that all would be well, that the choice she was about to make would bring her more joy and love and purpose than she could possibly imagine." Richard kissed her forehead gently. "I wish I could go back to that desperate Earl and tell him the same thing, that the woman opening her door would not just save his daughter, but would save him too, that she would teach him what real love looks like and give him a life worth living." They lay together in the darkness. They were two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful from it. Outside, a spring rain had begun to fall. It was gentle and steady, nothing like the tempest that had raged 30 years earlier. But Flora thought of that storm with gratitude now. It had brought Richard to her door. It had brought Sophie into her life. It had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed everything. Sometimes, Flora thought as she drifted toward sleep, the best things in life came wrapped in storms. Sometimes salvation appeared on your doorstep in the most unexpected forms. Sometimes the families we build are stronger than the families we are born into. And sometimes, just sometimes, fairy tales were real. They simply required courage, compassion, and the willingness to open your door when fate came knocking in the middle of a storm-filled night. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story of family, courage, and the love we choose touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of resilience, hope, and the families we build together.